Let's start session 3. I'm Tetsuya Yamashita, Professor of Law at Kyoto University. I'm a moderator of this panel. This session is covering whistleblowing systems. The systems are very important for finding corporate misconduct earlier, and whistleblowing is an important impetus for internal or external investigations. Whistleblowing systems have already been discussed in session 1, and then we would like to discuss more deeply, especially their challenges in practice and academic theory. Then we have distinguished panelists about this topic. So would you all introduce yourself briefly? So firstly, Brian.
Yes. Hi everybody, I'm Brian Young. I'm the director of the Whistleblower Office at the CFTC. Been there almost half a year, and before that I worked for the Department of Justice for about 20 years.
Next to Brian, Jane Norberg.
Yes, Jane Norberg. Hi, everybody. I was the chief at the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower up until about 3 years ago. Really was there right from the beginning of that program when it was first put in place as the deputy chief, and then later got promoted to the chief. And so really got to talk to whistleblowers on a daily basis and understand the issues that they were bringing to the SEC. And now I'm at Arnold & Porter, where I'm on the defense side. I help companies set up compliance programs. I help them with internal investigations, most times started from whistleblowers. And then I also help with SEC defense work. Happy to be here.
Thank you. Next to Jane, Mr. Kenneth, Political Polite Jr.
Sure. Good afternoon to everyone. Kenneth Polite. I serve as co-chair of the White Collar Government Investigations practice at Sidley Austin. I've spent about half of my career in private practice, almost exclusively in white collar defense. The other half has been with the Department of Justice, first as a AUSA in the Southern District of New York, later as the U.S. Attorney in my hometown of New Orleans, and then most recently, up to about a year ago, I served as the Assistant Attorney General and head of the entire criminal division that involved supervising over 1,400 public servants sitting in over 70 countries, dealing with the entire spectrum of criminal enforcement for the Department of Justice. Uniquely, I also served as a chief compliance officer for a brief stint as well. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Next, Ms. Susan Markel from Alex Partners.
Hi everybody, Susan Markle. I am probably one of the few non-attorneys in this room. I'm a CPA by trade, and I joined Jennifer in the plus 30 years in terms of working in the investigative space and dealing with these issues. I've been with Alex Partners for almost 16 years now in our investigations practice. Prior to that, I was with the SEC in the enforcement group for 15 years, and I was the chief accountant in enforcement for the last 5.5 years I was there. So I cover a lot of periods there, lived through WorldCom, lived through Enron, lived through stock option backdating, kind of the whatever fraud or issue was in vogue. I dealt with those. Now on this side, I work on investigations, so dealing with whistleblower issues as they come up. Sometimes we get brought in to assist with those, evaluate those, whether either before or after they're before the government. And so really just helping companies get through it, also working on the compliance side. So really happy to be here. It's a great conference so far.
Thank you. Finally, Professor Eugene Soltes from Harvard University.
That one might not work. I'll project. There we go. Thank you. It's always such a privilege and pleasure to come to. I think I will say, competing two best conferences in Jennifer's PCCE are among the best conferences of the year on this topic. I'm Eugene Soltis. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School. My scholarship and research is focused on the use of data and analytics and the evaluation and measurement of compliance programs. I'm also the founder and director of Integrity Lab, which is an outside organization that works heavily with organizations that are thinking about, not surprisingly, using data in the context of their compliance program and oftentimes in corporate resolutions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Then we would like to start from considering the purpose of the government whistleblowing system. So, Brian, could you explain the purpose and the overview of the CFTC whistleblowing system?
Of course, the CFTC is the regulator for derivatives in the United States. We have a whistleblower program that will give between 10 and 30% of any amount of money that the CFTC recovers in an enforcement action. Some of our resolutions are hundreds of millions of dollars, so it can be really lucrative if you're a whistleblower and your case is accepted by the CFTC. There's a website that you can file a tip. You tell the CFTC what you think the violation is. They investigate it. If they investigate it and make a recovery, then we make an adjudication. Do you get 10%, 30%, somewhere in between, or is the person ineligible? And at a fundamental level, the purpose of the whistleblower program is to increase compliance with the Commodity Exchange Act. The Commodity Exchange Act is the law in the United States that regulates and governs commodities. And we do that, number one, by getting tips that help our enforcement actions be successful. And number two, we want to encourage good compliance practices and self-disclosure. Because if a company has an internal problem, they may think, well, I'm not going to report it to the regulators. But whether or not the regulators find out may not be up to the company, because a whistleblower could come in and tell us about it if the company decides to sit on its hands. So the whistleblower program is also designed as an incentive to encourage companies to come in and self-report when there is a violation.
Thank you so much, Brian. So next, Jane, could you explain the purpose and overview of the SEC whistleblowing system?
Yes, so the CFTC's whistleblower program and the SEC's whistleblower program, I view them as sister programs, basically, because they were both born out of the same legislation, the Dodd-Frank Act, that was put in place in 2010. And the real purpose behind the SEC's whistleblower program is to incentivize individuals who have information about a possible violation of the securities laws to bring that information to the SEC so that they can potentially investigate and bring an enforcement action and ultimately stop the wrongdoing and the harm that was occurring at the time. There are three key prongs to that program: confidentiality of information provided by whistleblowers, the anti-retaliation protections, and then monetary awards. And I would say that those three things are critical to the success of that program, and if you took any one of them away, the program would not be as successful. Because first of all, whistleblowers want to feel confident that they can report information confidentially and anonymously, and that the SEC isn't going to turn around and go to their company, especially if they're an employer, and say, hey, we heard this from your employee, right? Because there are lots of things that whistleblowers would say could happen, right? They could get fired, it could be personal relationships, professional relationships, and so that's really critical to them. And then anti-retaliation protections, the SEC can actually bring an enforcement action against companies or individuals who demote, suspend, threaten, harass an individual because they reported a possible violation of the law to the SEC. And then finally, there's the monetary awards, which are the thing that I think get the most attention because the numbers can be really astronomical that get paid out to whistleblowers under this program. And that's the real, of course, I think, hook and incentive for some people to report the information in, because they're afraid that if they're going to lose their job, they view this maybe as an outcome at the end that might help them if they do lose their job. And just to give an idea of how successful that SEC program is, which I would call it personally a real force multiplier for the Division of Enforcement at the SEC. Tips from whistleblowers are used throughout the commission in investigations, And there's information that's put in by whistleblowers and by attorneys for whistleblowers that really move forward and enforcement action quite quickly than it did before the program. And so last year, the SEC received 18,000 tips from whistleblowers, which is the largest they've ever received in the history of the program. And over the course of the program since 2011, when it was first put in place, they've paid over $2 billion in awards to whistleblowers. I think the largest one was somewhere around $279 million to one person. So it can be kind of like winning the lotto. Other times, though, just to do the flip side of that, the SEC can only pay an award if money is collected. So if there was, say, a Ponzi scheme or some sort of a scheme where all of the money got dissipated and there's nothing to collect, the whistleblower could take a risk and get zero. So an award can be anywhere from $0, and the largest one being $279 million. But it's hard to know where the award might fall if the information is used. And then from the corporate side of it, if you think about the impact to companies, the sanctions, I think this was as of 2021, when I was still at the SEC, the sanctions against companies and individuals were over $6 billion in monetary sanctions against companies and individuals based on information that came from whistleblowers. So, and it's an international program as well. We receive information, the SEC receives information from whistleblowers all over the world. It is not just a US-based program, as I think when it first got stood up, everyone thought that it might be that way. But in fact, there are tips that come in from all over the world, and people from all over the world have been paid under that program. So it is something that I think companies, regardless of where they are, should be aware of, that information can get reported to a US regulator and potentially be used in an enforcement action against someone.
I'd love to just jump in because I think one of the beauties of this panel is you have such experts on already existing whistleblower programs. Jane, to hear you describe the SEC's and the CFTC's programs as being siblings, I think is striking, particularly in light of DOJ's new program, which doesn't have that statutory authorization in the same way. I'd love to hear from both of you, but also from you, Brian, a little bit about how much coordination did DOJ have with your respective agencies in setting up their new program, for example? And right now, as you sit, can you give any insight? How are your agencies kind of viewing the new DOJ program? I'm asking you to speak for SEC. That's not sure.
I can start. So I used to work at DOJ as a criminal prosecutor. We had all kinds of tools. We had search warrants, and we could do wiretaps. But the thing I was most envious of was the cash for reward whistleblower programs that the CFTC and the SEC had. It's a very, very powerful and desirable tool. And at my agency, between 30 and 40% of the enforcement actions at the agency originate with whistleblower tips. And so when DOJ proposed having their own whistleblower program, I thought it was a great idea. And I think an idea that I think, wow, that's great. It's just a great idea. There was a pretty fair amount of coordination. I mean, we had a lot of phone calls back and forth between DOJ and the CFTC. They wanted to see what kind of lessons we had learned, what kind of advice would have been our experiences. But I have no doubt that the whistleblower program that DOJ is setting up is going to improve enforcement outcomes. It's just, I think it's clear in my mind.
If I could just add on to that, I would say that when I looked at the DOJ's guidelines under their programs, I was very struck. It largely mirrors the SEC's and the CFTC's program. I mean, almost word for word in some instances. Obviously, there's some differences because that's a criminal program, and the SEC and CFTC are civil programs, but it largely mirrors it right down to a graphic that we had on our SEC website that the DOJ now has on their website with a couple of word changes. So it largely mirrors it. And so I think that they looked at the SEC and the CFTC program saw success that they were having and thought, why not? We're just going to do the same thing, and why, you know, change a formula that's working? And I think that that's really what happened.
And there's long been contacts between the criminal enforcers and whistleblower programs, because sometimes people file tips and we look at it and think, this might have some criminal merit to it. And so that had been going on before DOJ got involved in that game. But I expect that with their program, they're probably going to generate some leads that will result in criminal cases.
Yeah, in terms of, you know, the intake, the SEC, CFTC, or DOJ, when they come in, I think people often talk about, oh, it identified a certain issue, and, you know, so people can go and investigate that. But I think there's other benefits to that, and as Jane said, to help move them up the curve. You know, things like company lingo. You know, each company has its own way to describe things, and if you get an insider that talks about that to you, you are just so much farther down the road, or the way that things get reported, or key documents, or anything like that that really helps to put you in that room, you know, with the decision makers and all. I think is really a true benefit of the program as well. When I was at the SEC, we didn't have it yet, because I left at the beginning of '09, and I was envious of that when you guys got it afterwards, because there are things like that that, you know, just are a huge help.
Oh, thank you. Do you have Eugene? Do you have any comments?
I probably come, since everyone else on the panel comes from both the legal and enforcement side, I guess I'll speak for the business side. And I think when I see all these programs, I think they have strength because they are pushing organizations, or at least encouraging organizations, to develop better systems internally. You could say if any of these programs, SEC, CFTC, IRS, DOJ, are being utilized, it actually is already showing a failure within the organization. That is, that ideally you want people to be able to speak up to their manager. That's what psychological safety is. And so corporations that are effective are thinking about, where is that stronger, where is that weaker. Okay, that doesn't work, so that's why you have a centralized whistleblowing hotline that then gets to try to tackle that. I will say, I believe most of the cases, certainly more than half from what I understand, when they go to CFTC, SEC, DOJ, people have tried to speak up internally, and it's failed in some way, shape, or form. And I actually think looking at those numbers are actually quite humbling, because it actually shows that firms actually have the opportunity to at least try to tackle it, do some things to try to, ideally, probably try to mitigate maybe some of the sanctions, control it so they could at least then choose to disclose it themselves, rather than having it out there in the wild. And so one of the things I do hope the business community takes away from these programs is that if they don't deal with those issues, as large organizations will inevitably at some point, there are now incentives, high-powered incentives, for people to go outside and to be rewarded for those efforts. And I think that's a really interesting psychological nudge that should have at the highest levels of leadership in large corporations.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear you talk about the statistics, Professor, related to about half or maybe slightly more than half that have tried to speak up. I kind of see the glass half empty there. That means that the other half did not speak up, did not raise their hands internally, and instead went right past go and went straight to the government. I mean, look, we spent the last 2 or 3 years within the Department of Justice, certainly during the entire time I was there, encouraging corporations to invest in compliance, to build stronger internal reporting systems. And then you've got not 1, not 2, but now 3 different whistleblower programs that are encouraging people using the most powerful incentive, that is money, to come straight to the government as opposed to going internally. I think that there's a lot of companies that struggle with that right now.
And if I can just add on to your stat. So when I was at the SEC, we actually kept that stat based on individuals who worked at the company that they reported on, who also got an award, right? So we're talking about people who gave good information that resulted in an enforcement action where the SEC was able to fine a company more than $1 million, right? So good tips, not the bad tips, but the good tips. The individuals who got that award, at one point it was at 80%. 80% of them said that they reported to someone internally at their company about the issue and either felt like they weren't heard, that nothing happened with the information, or they would just wanted to report to both. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that, and this is actually something I see a lot now when I'm counseling companies. One of the biggest areas of risk, I would say, for a company is at the management level. Because a lot of times people don't pick up the phone and call the hotline, they don't necessarily fill out the web form, but they're going to tell their boss about the problem. And the boss maybe doesn't quite know what to do with the information. Either they sit on it or they believe that they resolved it at that moment, but the whistleblower feels like they report it to somebody who can do something about it at the company. And then if it doesn't get passed on and they don't get sort of contacted back by the company to say, hey, here's what we're doing with this, that becomes just a big problem at a lot of companies, because then the person feels like, well, I'm gonna go tell somebody who will listen to me. And then a lot of times that can also break down the employment relationship and end up in retaliation, or at least the person believing that they're retaliated against, right? So there's a lot of reasons to have very good touch points with those people who are reporting internally, and just making sure management is trained and understands that.
I can give a fun experiment, because I agree. A lot of times people going to managers, they don't know what to do with it. But even the centralized channel, so an experiment that we've done with, these are large, like Fortune 100, so sophisticated companies, is with their cooperation, let me just caveat this before I say what's next. I basically said, I bet myself and my team, we can get things that are basically fraud through your hotline, and you'll miss them. And so what we started doing is calling their hotline and actually going on the web. It works best by calling. Actually, it doesn't work as well if you go on the web, but if you call and you just start talking about how your boss is making you stay late. So literally we were saying, my boss is making me stay late, I missed my son's baseball game. You go on, and then at the end we would say, the worst part of it is last quarter, he made me hold back. And basically say, you basically do some channel stuffing, you can do some signature backdating, pick your favorite thing in the end. Every single one of those was always triaged through HR, because they see person's having an issue with their boss, and then the person's just tired of listening to you blabble on. It goes to HR, and then HR comes back and says, it sounds like you're having an issue with your boss, maybe we suggest some mediation. And I would say, if I was a reporter and I heard that, I'm like, mediation, SEC, the FTC, maybe I'll try them all now, because it sounds like they will listen, because clearly the company, and this is, I think, the challenge, because it's not companies trying to, but it's just the technical process sometimes makes it hard to get good information, and reporters are not trained to be investigators or attorneys to give clear, well-articulated tips. They give this a blabbling of all kinds of information.
Maybe AI could listen better.
Yeah. There we go. That would get AI in there. Good.
So we'll move into the next topic. So one of the main challenges around the whistleblowing systems prepared by the government is handling a number of whistleblowing reports, many of which are not always reliable. Could you speak about how to evaluate these reports and find reliable reports in CFTC? So Ryan, please.
Of course. I think one of the main challenges for the CFTC's program is running out of money. There's a pot of money that is used to pay whistleblowers. And we have really big awards, that the really big monetary penalties that the agency is obtaining. And if whistleblowers prove that they're entitled to part of that award, we're going to run out of money. So I can give you a long story about how it's funded, but funding the program is a challenge. In terms of triaging our tips, we get 1,700 tips a year. We got 1,700 last year. That's many fewer than the SEC. But I think we're able to process those pretty well. And some of the objections I've heard in the United Kingdom to the whistleblower program as well, it's really going to be difficult to triage and process all of your tips. But a lot of these tips you can get through pretty quickly. You can look at them and right off the top of the bat, you can exclude 40% of these. And in my experience, the processing of tips and triaging them is not a really big problem. Going a little bit to what we were talking about a couple minutes ago, the CFTC has had, I know the SEC has as well, we have made whistleblower payments to compliance officers before. And compliance people, there's a rule at our agency, if somebody waits, they have to report internally and then wait 120 days. If the agency doesn't take remediation in that 120 days, there can, the compliance officer can get a whistleblower award. And so sometimes people in countries where they're considering a whistleblower program say, well, whistleblower programs will ruin internal compliance functions. And that hasn't been my experience, because as Jane points out, most whistleblowers report internally first, and in any case we could put in place rules that try to make sure that the person, that the potential whistleblower abides by the compliance. And then I'd say that the final thing, one challenge that we have internally is determining whether or not a whistleblower is entitled to an award. And so you might have this big enforcement action and this big recovery, and you have to go back over and look historically and figure out how much did this whistleblower contribute? Did we already have that information? Was that information new? Were we going to get that information from somewhere else? And those, those considerations are challenging, and that's one thing that you have to do in order to determine how much money that whistleblower is entitled to.
Brian, you've been a prosecutor yourself. Do you think 120 days has proven to be long enough for an investigation to run to ground and determine the credibility of the tip that the compliance officer or whomever has come forward with?
I can't tell you that I have great visibility into that, but the awards that I can think of, the whistleblower would say they haven't done anything. Like I see, I've reported internally. A lot of times it actually is more than 120 days, but the rule is 120 days. But a lot of times the compliance officer will say, I reported it, and they haven't done anything. And we wouldn't say that that the company has to complete the investigation in 120 days. We would say that they have to start some sort of meaningful remediation. And generally speaking, when we award to a compliance officer, they say, I'm yelling into the void, this is going into a black hole, they haven't done anything. And so in those circumstances, we're comfortable giving an award because we think the company is just not taking this seriously.
I spoke at a conference to a group of accountants and chief compliance officers many, many years ago, but when the program was first starting out, and one woman at the reception afterwards described it as the 401k program for chief compliance officers. So yeah, I think that reflects a feeling that they probably tried to push things, and they don't get the resources to do it, they don't get the reaction to do it, they don't get the support to follow up on something, and so at least that comment, whether it was tongue-in-cheek or not, but it can provide an avenue for them to deal with things that they're legitimately probably frustrated about.
And from the SEC side, the triaging point about looking at the quality of the whistleblower reports. So because the SEC gets a much larger volume than the CFTC, there's actually an Office of Market Intelligence that looks at every single tip that comes into the SEC. Whistleblower tips, non-whistleblower tips, it doesn't matter. There is a group of individuals, I think when I was there it was somewhere between 30 and 40 individuals, attorneys, accountants, who took a look at every single tip that came into the SEC and made a determination if it was specific, timely, and credible enough to pass on to the Division of Enforcement or to examinations or wherever was the appropriate place to send that particular tip. Or if it wasn't something that was actionable at that time, it might just, it would still stay as intelligence in the database, but it might not get moved out of the Office of Market Intelligence. And so that's one difference. And I will say, look, they received 18,000 tips last year. I'm certain that all 18,000 were not actionable good tips. They clearly aren't. But the critical part is that there is a database where these tips reside, and so that if another tip comes in, say from somebody else, or 2 or 3 other people, and you connect the dots and put them together, it may look like a much bigger problem than it might from just one tip. And you might be interested to know, and Susan I'm sure knows this as well, is that Office of Market Intelligence and that database really got stood up because of the Bernie Madoff scandal, the big Ponzi scheme that occurred, and the issue was that tips were coming in from whistleblowers, but they were going to different offices, and no one was really connecting the dots. And so that was one of the remedial efforts that the SEC put in place in order to sort of help correct for that issue. And so there is a central triaging system, and I think the Office of Market Intelligence is really good. I mean, that's all they do, 24/7.
And I'll just put back on my DOJ hat for just a moment and kind of give a little insight to what I appreciate from there compared to the resources that both the CFTC and the SEC have in this space in terms of triaging these reports. You heard from Molly Moser earlier today, who's the head of MLARS, the Money Laundering and Asset Recovery Section, which houses this whistleblower policy for the Department of Justice. There is a grand total of 1 prosecutor who's handling all of those tips, who receives all of those emails that are coming in from the Department of Justice. I think he's perhaps being supported by one of my former senior counsel on an ad hoc basis, but it's really one person right now. And a couple weeks ago, we heard from the acting assistant AG about preliminary numbers about the number of calls that have come in on the DOJ hotline. She reported about 100 calls in the first month in a speech. I've since kind of gotten some appreciation of the fact that that's really closer to about 100 credible calls, and that the department actually has received somewhere between 300 and 400 total calls on the hotline, weeding out, some significant portion as not being particularly credible, not necessarily requiring additional follow-up. And so that percentage to me struck me as being probably more appropriate, more likely, more consistent with what we see from other hotline calls, and certainly closer to the figures and the noise that internal corporate hotlines typically see as well. But I'd be interested to hear your reflections on that, Professor.
I will say, certainly in internal company hotlines, I mean, the vast majority of things that come through, the average across companies around 70% is HR matters. So they're not, certainly not a DOJ, SEC, although increasing, I say the SEC, depending on if it's on your financial statements, it could be fraudulent, even if it's an HR matter. But 30% then are what we think of as more corporate misconduct-y. Those generally are substantiated at a comparatively higher rate because it's harder to just have something vague, like my boss doesn't like me. But I think the volume, going to the broad triaging, if you're starting to think about companies that have 100, 200,000, 300,000 employees, they're dealing with this volume. This is what they've always dealt with. And they're very vague because it takes a bit more, I think, courage to come to a regulator and speak up. Of course, I'm sure you get some crazy people that come with this spur of the moment, but people are much more willing in a corporate context to give very vague, very unstructured. And I think this is an area where companies are struggling, and I think some of the misses that companies have is simply because it's hard, especially when people are anonymous and come into a corporate hotline and people don't participate in the investigation. It is very hard, if not impossible, to substantiate. If you don't know which office, someone says it's a manager in an office, and you have 2,000 managers at 80 offices, it would be irresponsible to kind of try to boil the ocean, and both financially, but also just the reputational harm that could create. And so you just close that. You administratively close that without any subsequent action. So I see what good firms are doing are trying to effectively, I will say, reduce anonymity, i.e. either hopefully have people encourage themselves and try to nudge them, or figure out ways and other kinds of nudges, even technological ways to do that, to try to encourage engagement so people will participate in a confidential discussion with the company so they don't identify themselves, but they can provide investigators more information. In doing so, they're able to reduce that anonymity and improve the quality of tips to ideally try to actually take action. What we can see, one other kind of fact, what we can see from survey data, so a lot of our work, we're actually connecting investigations data to confidential survey data. There's a number of sensitivities doing that, but we can actually see what people put on their company survey around corporate integrity and then connect that to where investigations occur. interestingly enough, when you see people actually report an allegation, and it's not substantiated, and in many instances it's because it doesn't rise to, for example, harassment or some other issue. If they don't see an outcome, in many instances we see the reporter blames the company for not doing more. And they say, I don't respect the company as much. What we can see in the data 6, 9, 12 months later is people that actually report unsubstantiated allegations have a significantly elevated propensity to subsequently engage in misconduct themselves. It's on the order of 400 to 600% rise in probability. And that's not a blame the victim. I mean, it's simply a fact that comes from the data, but it actually shows the complex psychological relationships that are occurring in this reporting process, even within a corporate context.
And just to add something on the triage piece, at the SEC, it's not just individuals who can report. There's the cottage industry of law firms out there that this is their business. And so they are out there trying to find whistleblowers. And so people may come to them and they will actually triage themselves because they don't want to waste their time and go before the SEC and put together a package that they know isn't going to be picked up by somebody. So if you get some of those, and I don't know, Jane, if you can comment too, like how often that happened, but again, firms do this. They know what's going to get the SEC's attention, what's going to get them excited. Some of these people are former SEC folks. Jordan Thomas wrote the whistleblower rule or co-wrote the rule, and he is now at his own whistleblower shop. So they package it in a way, they get whatever documents they can, but when you get something like that, I would imagine those are pretty hard to turn down versus the ones that just say, rumor, local company cooking the books, which I actually got one time in an email, and it was anonymous. That one gets moved to the lower pile. But the law firms out there are really helping with that.
Yeah, I mean, that's correct. There are a lot of whistleblower plaintiff side law firms out there, and that's basically their whole business model is to get information to the good ones, right, are taking a look at the information hard before they submit it to an agency to determine whether there truly is a securities law violation or a violation of the law, because they know if they submit it, it's a lot of time, and they usually only get paid if the whistleblower gets paid. So it's a lot of work, and so they themselves have an incentive to put together the best tip, to get the most documents, to make sure that tip gets the attention when it goes in. And of course, if you've been at the regulator or at the government, you understand already sort of what the government is looking for and how they're gonna, what's gonna be the most useful for them. And so, yes, I agree that those are the tips that usually come in that are probably the most useful ones. Not always. I mean, there's plenty of tips. People do not need a lawyer, just to be clear, in the U.S. system to file a tip with the SEC. There have been people who have been paid under the SEC system who did not have a lawyer, never had a lawyer through the whole process. So you don't have to have a lawyer, but there are certainly lawyers out there who do this for a living. Yes.
Jane, you and Brian both mentioned the number of tips that the agencies have gotten. Brian, you kind of mentioned it was a lower number recently. Is a lower number bad? Is necessarily bad? Or are you always looking for that number to climb? And I suspect similar questions important for internal hotlines to be thinking about as well. Is it important for the number to be going up or down?
I mean, we report and track how many tips we get, but I'm not sure that figure is terribly probative of how successful the program is, because you could get a ton of tips for any reason. So somebody could see something in the news, and all of a sudden people start filing tips that have nothing to do with the commodities exchange. So that can definitely happen. I think when I look at the amount of tips, I think the thing that tells me the most is there is greater awareness of the program. So if somebody's doing a tip, at least they know of the program. But I haven't studied this, I'd like to, but I would posit that there's not a very close correlation between the amount of the number of TCRs, tips that we get, and the percentage of enforcement actions that involve a whistleblower. I suspect that latter percentage is relatively constant, and the tips could fluctuate. Having said that, I mean, more tips I guess is better in an absolute sense, but it's not tightly correlated. It's not like more tips equals better enforcement actions is a correlation.
Maybe one about the quantity, because the thing that, so I'm a quant by training, so like probably the opposite of a lawyer in that way, and that one thing that I'll say drew my interest of thinking about data in the compliance context is actually seeing what oftentimes chief legal officers, CCO present to a board, when their board, their audit committee around allegations, and if the number went up, they would generally have a story about how the program is great because people are more willing to speak up. And then if it went down, they would then change the story to there's less misconduct. And you can interpret the number however you want in some arbitrary sense. And I found that quite frustrating because it means it's very hard for someone sitting on their board to actually draw any inference because you have a chart every month, and whether it goes up or down, you can have someone give you a good story in either case. So what do I do with that? And we can see as people are evolving more, and I think this is the DOJ's evaluation of corporate compliance programs, and I think greater sophistication is coming into the boardroom of asking deeper questions, starting to actually ask people to explain that number. So if the number's going up and you're going to say it's because people are more willing, you should actually be able to point to some, for example, survey data and actually look at people's willingness to speak up. If that has stayed the same or gone down, that's not like a plausible explanation of the story or narrative. And so great CCOs are starting to be able to describe a narrative kind of end to end to explain why things are going up and down where, so is that a particular location, function, role, and connect that to other pieces of data, HR, turnover within the organization, or survey data about what people are thinking and doing, to try to create a narrative so it's not just, I'll say, ex post rationale of what's ever happened.
Yeah, I kind of think the statistic I think is the most helpful is what portion of the enforcement division's docket comes from whistleblower matters. I mean, that's ultimately because they have a finite resource, and they can get cases through market surveillance, they can get cases by reading the newspaper, they can get cases from a whistleblower. But if a high percentage of the cases that they pick are from a whistleblower, to me that's the best barometer of success. Or if conversely there's a low percentage, and I see the percentage going down, I would think, okay, well maybe there's some adjustment we need to make in the program. But in terms of the absolute number of the tips, that's I think kind of limited. And you can break that down. How many of the tips were actually jurisdictional? How many of the tips actually alleged a violation of the Commodity Exchange Act? How many of sometimes people call up and say, hey, I've got an OSHA problem. Well, that's not our situation. How many tips came from insiders? I think those subsets would be helpful. I mean, I think that's probative. But the tips in absolute terms I don't think tells you too much.
Without going into too much detail, I've had a couple of clients that have dealt with the issue of numbers going up in connection with there being credible findings of the hotline being used in a retaliatory or kind of most like misuse of the hotline to attack or to get an individual employee in trouble in some ways. And I'm wondering if that's something, some of those companies then start talking about, well, should we be messaging not that you should use the hotline for everything, but maybe responsible use of the hotline? And then there's a question of whether that has a chilling effect, of course, in some respects. I'd be interested to know if that's something where either the agencies have dealt with the use of hotlines in a retaliatory fashion, and perhaps how other internal hotlines kind of combat that issue at all.
I can give.
You have that in your
Well,
article.
I'll give one just fact because it's interesting. Raising that is that I would say even a 25-year-old MBA student knows that if they think that they could be fired, that if they would call a hotline and just make up some allegation around how their manager was ill-treating them. So ideally, throw in the word retaliation.
Yeah.
You're good for a while longer, because and I will say it's pretty scary that people know that, and so you can easily see how that can be misused in that context as really a technique to postpone one's employment quite unfairly.
I would say if you have that problem, call me.
Exactly.
because, you know, and that happens, right? I always joke about, like, people cloak themselves in the whistleblower flag to prevent a possible issue that they see coming down the pike if they're like a poor performer or something like that. And while companies have to be extremely careful, it's all very facts and circumstances driven, it doesn't forever protect someone, especially if there's real performance problems or real wrongdoing by the individual who is reporting. And I've dealt with that numerous times since I've been on the private side. So I do hear you, it does happen.
Thank you so much. I want to move to next topic. So, I would like to discuss about the Japanese firm because many Japanese attend the conference, workshop, and hear the discussions. So, whistleblowing systems are important also in Japan. Many or most of the recent corporate misconduct that has attracted public attention in Japan has been discovered by internal whistleblowing from employees. So therefore, many Japanese firms try to utilize internal whistleblowing systems as effective. However, it is not always easy for Japanese companies to make internal whistleblowing systems function effectively due to the characteristics of Japanese employment practices, what traditional Japanese employment practices, and the Japanese culture. For example, long-term employment system or often or sometimes lifetime employment, seniority-based promotion, and also seniority-based wages curve, that the wages kept lower in the younger generations compared to their ability and services to the company. And employees can take back the loss later in their career in the company. Brings Japanese employees significant risks to be excluded from their company when they make an internal whistleblowing disclosure about misconduct in their workplace. In addition to that, there is a view that, in general, Western culture emphasizes independent view of self, in which the self is distinct and exists independently from the surroundings, people, and things. Whereas Eastern and Japanese culture emphasizes considerations for and conformity to and harmonious interdependent relationships with others. And such interdependent view of self, in which the self exists in interdependent relationships through the surroundings, people, and things, is predominant. So such differences in employment environment and culture could affect the differences between the US and Japan in psychological resistance to using the internal whistleblowing systems. So could anyone tell us any comments or suggesting about the such challenging in Japan?
Thank you for that insight. That was very insightful, and it made me think of something when I was a criminal prosecutor. If if we were looking at a potential crime and there are a bunch of traders on the desk and you're sitting with the FBI and thinking, who are we going to approach first? You'd almost always go to the youngest person on the desk because that person hasn't been there as long and they may be going somewhere else, or somebody who's out of the industry. So I can see what you're saying because that's the most likely person to turn on the company. So I can see what you're saying if you're at a company where people tend to stay for a really long time and don't move around as much in industries. I could see how that profile of employee would be less likely to engage in whistleblowing. That's just been sort of my experience doing corporate enforcement.
So, one question, are there whistleblower protections in Japan? So if someone reported, right, and then there was an adverse action taken, are there retaliation protections for that person?
Yeah, the law requires the companies to protect such employees.
Okay. I mean, so one way I was thinking about it is if, I understand the concept of worrying, sort of thinking about others ahead of you, right, and your coworkers, and that maybe whistleblowing might potentially harm the company or something like that. I think one way you could think about it and still stay true to that is that if something that the company is doing is harming investors or others outside of the company, right, then I think that you're still staying true to the fact that you're protecting others, right? So if you think about it from the SEC's perspective, many times there was wrongdoing happening and people lost life savings, right? Or lost a lot of money and they were just defrauded. And so in that sense, right, you're still staying true to that thought of I want to do good for my fellow man, and that's the way to do it. It's just sort of flipping a little bit how you're thinking about, well, who is the person that you're doing the good for?
And I would completely agree with you, Jane, and I frankly would contend that Western culture probably elevates that independent concept of whistleblowing and the ramifications or consequences of misconduct, and that in a lot of the cases, particularly when I think about my time as U.S. Attorney in New Orleans, where let's face it, Louisiana is like a hotbed of public corruption. Oftentimes, the messaging that I found to resonate better with folks is that this isn't just about us punishing one particular politician. The real benefit here is that public corruption corrupts our trust in government. It corrupts and limits our ability to get infrastructure in place. It corrupts and limits our ability to get outside investments because they don't trust the business community in this state of Louisiana. And so by you, individual persons, stepping forward and reporting misconduct, you are actually benefiting the whole of the community, the whole of the city, the whole of the state. And in many ways, that's a theme that I found resonating even more effectively than really talking about the individual consequences in that space.
I suppose you could also try to emphasize the confidentiality. If I don't know what the confidentiality provisions are in Japanese whistleblower regimes, but in the Dodd-Frank context for CFTC and SEC, the whistleblower can be confidential, and we get confidential submissions. We'll have lawyers submit a tip and say, my client is remaining anonymous, and this is what he or she is going to tell you. And there are cases that we have where that person remains anonymous throughout the entire process. Now we have to know if they get a check at the end of the day, we have to know who they are. But that is very, very, very far into the process. And so if somebody felt a very tight affinity or a friendship with their workplace that they were blowing the whistle on, perhaps you could help encourage them to blow the whistle by emphasizing probably nobody is going to find out about this. You can collect your reward and be anonymous and nobody's going to know.
Jane, since the SEC has that obligation to keep things anonymous too, do you remember getting any tips that were great tips and they were like zeroing in on a certain spot, channel stuffing in this particular quarter in this particular company, and you'd want to run with it, but how do you protect that person's anonymity you know, if you send a document request that asks for that specific information and is just targeted on that, cat's out of the bag. So what does the SEC do in that case?
Yeah, that was, I would say, the single biggest issue I dealt with on a daily basis as the chief of that program is protecting the confidentiality and anonymity of a whistleblower. And so, to Susan's point, if an employee came in and told the SEC about something, what we couldn't do is immediately send a subpoena and ask for the exact same thing that the person just told us, because if the person reported internally, they're gonna know, right, immediately. And so we had to come up with very creative ways to style our subpoenas and what to ask for to an attempt to protect the person. And so in thinking about it from your culture, like within a company itself, I think, you know, requiring confidential and anonymous reporting, you know, potentially could be helpful if that doesn't already exist. And then just making sure that those who are doing the investigations understand that they need to maintain that person's confidentiality as much as they possibly can and still do a good investigation. That happens in the US too, right? Because in the US, you have to have confidentiality and anonymity in an internal investigation as much as you possibly can, because if you don't, employees are not going to report. They're not going to trust the hotline, they're not going to report internally, and they're not going to trust the company, and instead they're going to go right to the SEC or the CFTC or DOJ and trust that they're going to protect their information.
Jane, can I ask a question? So thinking about these tips from foreign countries, your office used to produce the annual report that had this very helpful Appendix C with a list of, 40 plus countries from which you'd receive tips.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's been dropped intentionally or what, but I don't seem to see it anymore. But from 2021, there were more than 12,000 tips that year, 40 plus countries, but 0 from Japan. 120 odd from the UK, by contrast.
Mm-hmm.
But interesting.
Yeah, no, it's true. There were certain countries that were always at the top of that list. The UK, sometimes Australia, China. Those were the top 3, I would say. And you're right, not many at all from Japan. I'm not even sure if we ever got a tip from Japan or not. I don't know why. I left 3 years ago, and I always published that chart, and I don't know why the program has become less transparent. It has become less transparent, and I'm not completely sure why, but that was after I left.
We missed that chart.
Yeah. And it's helpful to companies' compliance programs too.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think the data is very important. And
Like hotspots.
yeah, exactly.
Well, I think the way that the SEC releases their awards too is not very helpful too from a transparency, because it'll say on X day we awarded X dollars to a whistleblower for Y, and that's about it. Versus if they could really tell more about it, they self-reported to somebody or something like that, that would be more instructive and allow you to analyze actually the ones that did get across the finish line.
Yeah, and when I was there, we were very thoughtful about how we redacted because we had to balance the statutory requirement that we had to protect the confidentiality of a whistleblower with not going too far, and in order to let people know here's a message out of this case. And so if somebody did report internally, in the ones that I did, I almost always said it unless there was some real risk to a confidentiality issue there. But if it's not tied back to any specific enforcement action, I just don't think there's any real reason to not say if someone reported internally. And I personally think it's very helpful to internal compliance functions at companies to have that data.
I just wanted to ask a question about the whistleblower lawyers coming out of some comments that Mark Phillip was making on the first panel, because he kept emphasizing, well, how much money they're making. And what I was interested in knowing is, one of the reasons I've always favored bounties is not only to give employees some income who may very well lose their jobs or livelihoods if they get found out, but also the whistleblower lawyers I speak to talk about spending money on investigations. They're not just packaging it, but they're investigating. So I was curious what percentage of the tips that you have had that lead to awards. There was a whistleblower lawyer who actually did some work to help you figure out we've got a case? Or are they just free riding, packaging what the whistleblower said in a nice way, but they're not actually doing any preliminary work, they're not helping you get ahead?
Yeah, and I'll let Brian answer as well, but when I was at the SEC, there were lawyers who were very active in the case. If there was an investigation ongoing and the person had a lawyer, of course the lawyer was involved in every meeting with investigative staff to walk through the information. At the end of the day, it's the whistleblower, right, the information that they're providing and the help that they can provide to investigative staff. That's the most important and compelling, and that's what's going to get them the award. But I would say it really depended. I mean, some people really knew how to package a great stuff. But when I say package, I mean sometimes hiring their own forensic accountants, hiring their own investigators and experts on their own dime, right, without knowing whether or not they were ever going to get a penny at the end of the day. And so I agree, there's definitely work by the good whistleblower attorneys that goes into it. There's no question about it.
Yes, I agree with that. I don't have a statistic, but I'm fairly confident that whistleblowers who are represented by counsel are overrepresented in terms of they're more likely to get an award. And one of the things that than people who are not represented. That's not because we favor anybody. There's a self-selection process there. A lawyer is to spend his or her time on it. So there is an efficiency benefit to articulating the complaint better. That can save our time. One really large benefit, if the Whistleblowers Council is good, is to serve as a filter to ensure that the whistleblower is not taking privileged information out of the company if the whistleblower works at the company. And then also to ensure that if there is something that is potentially privileged, they set up a colleague to do a screen, and it doesn't get to the CFTC or the enforcer at the SEC. And you can also, the whistleblower's attorney can, some whistleblowers can be erratic, and they can be a restraint on that. Nobody wants to see the whistleblower go in and download his or her entire PST file. They don't want to see anybody ripping out the computer hard drive. And a good whistleblower from the company, and a good whistleblowers council will be a check on that. But I think particularly the privilege screen to make sure, hey, do not take any attorney-client communications and use that as part of your complaint can be a good restraint on that.
So thank you very much for the excellent discussion. So I'd like to know the cultural difference matters more. So actually, it was mentioned that even in the US, internal reporting is generally preferred over direct external reporting to the SEC or the DOJ or some other authorities. It is said. And do you have any? Sorry. Let's try a different one. So, do your excellent panelists have any thoughts on why this is so? So after all, is there still a feeling of betrayal toward one's fellow workers if one suddenly makes an external report? Or it is out of fear of more severe retaliation from the company in the case of external reports? Why I ask this question is the reason why Japanese and ordinary worker does not make many internal reports, even internal reports, and they feel the very high psychological barrier to make such reports due to their understanding of the world or the relationship with their fellows. So I'd like to know what exactly happens in the ordinary American workers when they face the chance of internal reporting or external reporting. So that is my question. Thank you.
Well, I can take a stab because I think, whistleblowing is a pretty high bar we're talking about. I think the question is more broadly around speak up culture broadly. Daisuke and I know we've had some great conversations talking about, the kind of hierarchical system of there's not a deep secondary labor market. Those are all impediments to speak up culture more broadly. I mean, if you're set in kind of a company, that's where you plan to spend the next 30 years, you're not just talking about, you're not going to bring up misconduct, you're not going to disagree with your boss on a lot of other things that are not misconduct. So that's just impediment across the board from I'll say, the high psychological safety to be able to speak up. The one thing, and I think I see we're making a dichotomy between, let's say, Japanese culture and other, let's say, certain Western cultures. At least I'll say we look at a lot of survey data around psychological safety and speak up. And at least I'll say, I haven't seen, I'll say, just a Japanese company within Japan, but we see lots of data around multinationals that have Japanese, offices across Japan. And I will say, of course, they're lower in Japan, but they're lower in a whole pile of other parts of the world as well. At least as I see, the variation seems to occur. One thing's of location, which is both office and country. You think of function, marketing, sales, engineering. I hypothesize that one would actually still see much more variation across role and function. So if one would look at even in the US, if you look at people that are in sales in Boston versus engineering in San Francisco, you're much likely to see as much variation across those two subcultures as you would see between US overall and Japan overall. And so I think part of maybe the opportunity here is actually looking deeper within the data to understand where even within, let's say, a Japanese organization, you would actually have parts that are actually comparatively strong on speak-up culture and where they're comparatively weaker. So look for that intravariation rather than just on average saying it's low compared to somewhere else. A lot of the volume in the US, for better or worse, as we've kind of discussed earlier, people have a strong speak-up culture, especially like younger people have a strong speak-up culture. A lot of it's not actually like valid allegations. They're complaining a lot about a lot of things. And I don't know, that generates some good volume because you identify things. It also generates a lot of noise that has to be sifted through by compliance and HR and regulators too. Two-edged sword.
So thank you so much. So what I'm wondering is if the younger generation is more familiar with speak-up culture, then the external report, direct external report, the number of direct external report will increase in the future or not? What do you think about it?
This is dangerous. I have to do like a prediction market. Well, I'll speak. I mean, my hypothesis, and this is looking, and I'm now going to put my professor hat on, and I know we have others, is that people, I mean, you look at social media, I can't fathom, I mean, I'm not that old, but I can never fathom going online and like posting a video complaining about a brand, organization, like my company. I can't fathom that because of all these other, it's permanent forever. The average person that I would say is like 20 or 25 does not hold that view, I think, on average. And that's not just US, that's globally. You're willing to go on social media and just say stuff that will last forever. And that has dramatic, repercussions on both accountability, but also just people sharing information more broadly. So my hypothesis, if I was going to take a bet, yeah, there will be more down the road.
Okay, thank you.
So I'm deeply sorry that.
Is there another question?
Okay.
If we have time for one more, I can also hold it. I know we're over time.
Last question.
Yeah. Okay.
I was going to quickly just ask the views of the panel on the idea of companies using incentives for whistleblowers, similar, having their own sort of financial incentives for people who report internally. And I'm interested in views, from an academic perspective. I see this in private practice, and I'm sure you all do as well, and then also from the government perspective.
I mean, I'll defer to the rest of the panel, but if you could make some payment to an employee and that payment avoided an enforcement action or an investigation, I'm sure the amount of that payment would cost less than the enforcement action or investigation. It's not an efficient way to deal with problems to go to court. So I can see some merit to it.
Yeah, we actually talked a little bit about this earlier, and I think there's a lot of companies that kind of hypothesize about, in light of all of these whistleblower programs, should we have our own? Should we be giving bounties? I have not seen that. I think where I've seen some companies come closest is increasing some rewards in terms of annual rewards, for example, courage and ethics. There's a couple of companies that give those types of annual awards. Perhaps that includes some notoriety at a shareholder meeting or at some large corporate function. Perhaps the person's getting a free trip somewhere as part of that recognition. But other than that, I think most companies have stayed clear of actually giving what we would identify as bounties in the same way. At least that's been my experience thus far.
Yeah, mine as well. I mean, you just have to be, the one thing I would say is that two things. Number one, if you're going to give an award, even a recognition to somebody, you got to make sure they want it publicly,
That's
right? Because you don't want to, expose somebody publicly who doesn't want to be. And then the second thing is, and there was talk about this when I was at the SEC, is could a monetary payment by a company somehow rise to the level of impeding someone from reporting to the SEC? It never really came across our radar in the sense that, oh, this company's paying. I mean, no one's ever going to pay as much as the government can pay in that perspective. And so I think the way I view it now on this side is, I think a company can do what they want as long as they're not impeding someone, right? As long as you're not saying, we're going to give you this money, and by virtue of giving you this money, you can't report it to a government agency. That's just entirely illegal, and you can't do that. So that's, I think, the fine line that you have to walk. But I have not actually seen companies pay people, other than maybe in a bonus.
Yeah, and I think, as Jane said, you're never going to give a big enough number that it'll really matter. But I think to whistleblowers or relators, thank you is one of the biggest things you can tell them, because part of it is they just don't feel heard. Thank you, we understand, we're going to look into it, and that goes a long way, more than $1,000 or $2,000.
I'll give one slightly amusing example. So I was contacted by a company that was going to do that as a pilot program. They wanted to write a case study because they wanted to get credit, like in a Harvard Business School case study on this innovative compliance endeavor. They then had something while I was working on this to write the case. Actually had their first example. They were going to give $10,000 for actually something that was pretty significant. It was a bribe. Before they actually ever went ahead with it, two things happened. First, they realized actually they did some more investigation. It actually turned out to be quite material, and so $10,000 actually was trivializing it. And this was actually before all the whistleblowing programs. But if something is potentially like many millions of dollars, giving someone $10,000 actually just seems like trivial, especially now with the outside incentives. It just seems like you're cheapening it. Two, and actually why the case doesn't exist is their outside counsel correctly pointed out that by giving this person the money and recognizing them publicly, actually in a Harvard Business School case, they have to now disclose it to the government, because now they're literally recognizing it. So their ability to choose not to disclose it to DOJ or SEC is eliminated by almost their own program, because they were recognizing their own misconduct publicly. And so that got shot down. So it never happened.
So I'm deeply sorry that the time is too short for this session and to finish the discussion now. So thank you all the panelists and all attendees for the fascinating, active discussions. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much.